So seafood is the thing you really have to understand if you're going to talk about the oceans and what people are doing out there. And then China is the player. China has, by an order of 10 or 20, bigger distant water fleet than any other country in the world. They're bigger than the next 4 fleets combined. It's a simple, spoiler alert. And to that story is huge forced labor on the fishing vessels and a lot of other types of illegality, but quite especially trafficked forced labor on the vessels. Then on land, the findings were again concentrated on forced labor. And so that's in the processing plants, largely in one province called Shandong Province near the coast. And that's where much of the infrastructure for processing occurs. And in those factories, what we found was significant amounts of forced labor in the form of Xinjiang labor.
Hi, Ian. We're very excited to have you on today on one of our Fair Talks episodes. We're going to unveil the human and environmental costs of China's seafood dominance in our interview. And Ian, you're an investigative reporter, director and founder of the Outlaw Ocean project, exploring the lawless frontier of the high seas. But in your own words, can you tell us a bit of who you are and what exactly is the Outlaw Ocean project?
Yeah, so who I am is a journalist. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I spent most of my career at the New York Times, and then about 3-4 years ago, I left and created this small shop. It's a journalism organization, as you said. Our focus is, again, as you said, the watery 2/3 of the planet and specifically human rights and environmental concerns out there. But how we do that journalism, we also try to sort of do things differently, both in the reporting process and then in the distribution of the journalism. The reason is that we humbly, think that it produces better journalism, but also it produces more impact from the journalism if you can do it a different way. Some of those differences are, all the stories are reported in theater, as you say. So on the ships at sea or in the conflict zones that we cover on land. We also try to make the stories deep dive and highly narrative, which is to say they tell a story, not just sort of deliver an article. And then lastly, we distribute the journalism very differently in that we produce it all with philanthropic dollars and average subscribers to the organization who support us. But we produce it all in-house, and then we take the finished product out, and we partner with lots of news outlets around the world to get it to run in lots and lots of countries and lots of different languages, and that gets a much bigger footprint.
And now I would like to know a bit more about the investigation I was mentioning. Your most recent investigation, titled "China, the Superpower of Seafood," deals with the fact that at sea and on land, the country dominates the fishery sector. Can you briefly summarize the investigation's focus and its key findings regarding the environmental and human costs associated with China's seafood production?
Yeah, I mean, seafood is the product that is most important if you're going to think about the world's oceans. It's even more than oil and gas or, kind of biomedical discoveries or, other things that you might get out of the waters. Seafood is the thing that has the most people working out there. 55 million people work out there, and about 50 of them are on fishing boats, and the other 5 million are on merchant ships. So seafood is the thing you really have to understand if you're going to talk about the oceans and what people are doing out there. And then China is the player, if you're going to think about who the biggest players are. China is biggest in 2 metrics. It's biggest in terms of the number of ships it has, quite especially, well, in inland waters, near shore waters, but also on the high seas, so the distant water fleet. That refers to international waters or foreign waters. And those are big industrial boats typically, and they're all over the planet, and they often travel in big fleets. And they're the kind of major players that pull large amounts of seafood out of the water. And China has, by an order of 10 or 20, bigger distant water fleet than any other country in the world. They're bigger than the next 4 fleets combined. So China has the most ships, and then also China has the biggest processing capacity. So even, seafood pulled out of French waters by a French French vessel or US waters by an American vessel, there's a good chance it's getting sent away to China to be processed in these factories. And then most of what China produces, what it fishes, goes through those plants as well. So that means much of the world, whether it's Japan or Germany or Canada, much of their seafood is routing one way or another through China. And if you're going to really understand, how this product gets to your plate, then you really got to take on China. And then lastly, China is of great interest to a journalist because it's just so hard to penetrate. It's just a closed black box, and knowing what's happening there, the data that comes out of there, the conditions in factories there, what's going on the ships, where those ships are going, what the government has decided, all that is very, very difficult for a journalist to figure out. So that, is another enticement for us to sort of take an investigative look at China in the global seafood supply chain.
What were your key findings, or looking at specifically what I've read about the Uyghurs who are forced to process this world's fish? How did you, especially considering what you were saying, that it's really difficult to investigate anything in China, what did you find and how did you get to these findings?
Yeah, so again, if you think of this product called seafood, first think of it, bear in mind, it's not like a soccer ball or a computer chip or a Nike shoe, or in your case, an Adidas shoe. It's a product that traverses two universes. So it's coming, there's one huge universe, which is on the ships, on the water, and the other universe on land. Okay, now seafood. So if you're going to investigate it, then you've got to have a dual strategy. How do we figure out what's going on the ships? Well, that's an elaborate process. You have to go out to sea. You got to find them. You got to get on board if you can, talk to workers. That's a huge process. It's part of why it took 4 years to produce the investigation. The simple, spoiler alert end to that story is huge forced labor on the fishing vessels and a lot of other types of illegality, illegal fishing in the form of Chinese vessels invading other countries' waters or using the wrong type of gear, these sorts of crimes, but quite especially trafficked forced labor on the vessels. Then on land, the findings were again concentrated on forced labor. And so that's in the processing plants, largely in one province called Shandong Province near the coast. And that's where much of the infrastructure for processing occurs. And in those factories, what we found was significant amounts of forced labor in the form of Xinjiang labor. So your listeners may not know. So Xinjiang region in Western China, landlocked, the most landlocked plot of land on the planet, about 2,500 miles from the coast. Muslim minority, largest minority is Uyghurs, and Uyghurs have long been quite intensely oppressed, by some descriptions in the EU and the UN and the US. There's a genocide happening there, and mass internment, forced sterilization. A tenth of the population at one point was all in internment camps. So what we discovered was that there's this, especially post-COVID, a labor shortage in the processing plants. Not enough workers because the country was locked down. And so the fishing industry turned to the government for help. The government said, we're here to serve. And they began moving, thousands of Uyghurs from Xinjiang across the country by plane, train, bus into these plants. And this is a forced labor situation, a state-run program. Uyghurs and Xinjiang workers in general are categorized by most of the world categorically. So much like child labor or prison labor or North Korean labor, it doesn't matter if you interview that child in an Indian brick factory or that North Korean worker in Russia. It doesn't matter if they tell you that they're happy and that they're getting a wage and that they came there willingly. These demographics are viewed categorically as forced labor because the state, obligates them to do certain things, and they don't really have the freedom to tell you honestly whether they want to be doing that or not. And if they turn down the job, then there are real, well-documented consequences for them and their family. So Uyghurs are considered state-sponsored forced labor, and if you find them in your product line, in your supply chain, working in your factory that supplies you abroad, then you got a big problem vis-a-vis the law. And that's what we found in Shandong seafood processing plants, is lots of Uyghurs. And
looking at what you just said about all this forced labor, but also that China is a superpower in seafood, and a big portion is going to the US and Europe of that seafood. How can we make sure that, or how can we look at the supply chain in a way that we make sure there's no forced labor there? Or is there a way to prevent it? For example, also looking at the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Yeah, I mean, the Uyghur Forced Labor, to go backwards, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a U.S. law, very unusual and very strong law. It has a mechanism in it that puts the burden on companies to prove that they don't have Uyghurs. There's a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, meaning you can bring evidence to show that it's not the case. But the presumption is that if there are Uyghurs in your plant, then they are forced, and you have to prove that they're not or they don't exist. And so this law has been unusually powerful in the U.S. There's a similar law for North Korean laborers. It's called CATSA. It has the same mechanism. So if a product, the products that have come before have been cotton and tomatoes and solar panels and textiles in general. If a product line in general is found to be heavily tied to Uyghurs, then what happens is when those products arrive to the U.S. Customs and Border, to the port, they're stopped and they're set aside and they're banned essentially, and that's hugely consequential. Probably the strongest thing that you can do using commerce. So this is a strong law, and up till now, seafood was not on the radar because no one thought that seafood would be tied to Xinjiang because they're so far apart from each other and other reasons. So this is what the investigation sort of, kind of revealed. Other things to your first question that can be done in general, it's tough. I mean, seafood is a more difficult, more tangled, longer supply chain than other products, and a lot of it's coming from places where enforcement and jurisdiction are murky, which is to say, if you think of a fishing ship as a factory and the factory is in motion and the factory is in outer space and no government has jurisdiction in outer space and no government has cops in outer space. Okay, and the factory is floating through space. That's going to be a tough factory to inspect. Are you allowed to? Can you get out there? Will they see you coming? Same thing with a fishing ship on the high seas. High seas doesn't belong to any government in particular. There aren't cops out there, and they're in motion and they're far away. And so inspecting ships is tough. On land, it gets a little bit easier, but when you're dealing with China, it's not so easy. You can't just show up unannounced to a plant. You can't write up a report that says they've done terribly and not get kicked out of the country. There are real consequences for operating in China, whether you're an NGO or a company or anyone or a news outlet. And if you don't play by their rules, you typically get bounced. And a lot of companies have decided, okay, we're willing to play by your rules, but it's going to probably eventually catch up with them in the form of this kind of expose where someone finds a way to expose that by being there and playing by their rules, they're actually breaking other rules or laws or ethical boundaries that they might not want to be associated with. And now a journalist has revealed that they are.
Looking at changing food systems, because we were saying like it's really difficult to change something, like it's difficult to find a spot where change can be made. The US imports roughly 80% of its seafood, and China supplies more than any other country. And as an example, as of 2017, as it says in your investigation, half the fish used in fish sticks served in American public schools have been processed in China. Isn't that sort of a very big lever to create change, to dig into these very solid food systems and say, maybe we won't get this seafood and put fish sticks in our canteens or something like that? Well, how do you feel about that, about changing the food systems from the within?
Yeah, I mean, this is always so. First of all, you're exactly right in your description of how difficult it's going to be to fix the problem. Secondly, I humbly would submit that I don't have all the answers as to how to fix the problem. But I would also, and this has come up in our interactions with industry players and their lobbyists and spokespeople. They've often attempted to put the burden back on us, meaning journalists and NGOs, to say, okay, fine. If we've got a problem, how do you suggest we fix it? And it's sort of like saying, well, Woodward and Bernstein in Watergate didn't have to fix government corruption. Like when journalists expose problems, it doesn't become their problem to solve it. It becomes the industry's problem, who's profiting from it, to solve it. And they're actually best equipped to do so. Again, we had this interesting critique that came out, which was completely upside down from an industry blog that said, well, look, it took those guys, those journalists, 4 years to do this investigation, and it was clearly super difficult, and they had to engage in all this stuff. How did they expect us in the corporate world to solve this problem? And I remember thinking, my goodness, this is so Orwellian. It was difficult and slow for us to do all that work because the corporate players have a huge wall that don't allow us to see their data, to see their supply chain, to get on their ships. They own these supply chains. They actually have the most ability to see where their stuff is going and have the most leverage to tell their factory partner in China, we're not going to do business with you more unless you give us the ability to do these things. We're going to pull out. The real issue is they don't want to impose those things because the only way that they will have any teeth is if they threaten to pull out. And to pull out would mean huge economic consequences, and companies don't want to lose the cost savings that they benefit from by operating in a place like China. But to answer your question, I think that there are ways. I talk to smart people who work on these things, and they say, look, they're not perfect. And ultimately, a pullout of certain regions or certain industries in China might be necessary. But there might be ways to adjust the relationships and the terms of how to operate in China so that you get sufficient paperwork and spot check capabilities and vetting process of the conditions on the ships and in the plants so that you as a brand in Germany or the US or wherever are safe. But I don't know a huge amount more about whether that's realistic or not. It's really kind of on them to start figuring it out, because now they're going to be looking at federal repercussions, like legal repercussions, if they don't. And that's probably not something they want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And coming back to what you were saying, that the journalist, it's not the journalist's responsibility to solve the problem, but you expose it. What impact, as you can tell so far, has your investigation had? Or how can you, as a journalist, make sure that that it's heard in many spaces of the world, and that the people who need to see it and hear it actually see it?
Yeah, I mean, and I would just take one sidestep, which is to say, well, I don't think it's the journalist's responsibility to solve the problems they highlight. At the same time, I think we have to try to help move the conversation in that direction. So what we did, and whether it's enough or not, I don't know, but is we have a page called Solutions where we interviewed about 24 industry and academics and NGOs and said, what do you think? Because this is what you work on, fixes. So what do you think? And we don't need to agree or disagree. That's not relevant. We're just here to report what the diversity of experts say. And so on that page, we have a huge variety of what others say, including some within the industry themselves, and say, here's the menu. But it's not me to weigh in with like, this is the silver bullet. That's inappropriate as a journalist. But we don't want to also demoralize people by giving them no path. So that's why we've carved out a space where some people give some guidance. How do we make sure it gets impact? So in this case, we help, this investigation took 4 years, and a good 6 months of that last year was spent carefully setting up this kind of international coalition, if you will, of partner publications around the world. Usually we went for the top tier newspaper or magazine in each country. So in Spain, El País, and in France, Le Monde Diplomatique, and in Germany, I'm going to mispronounce it, Die Zeit. Die Zeit.
Die Zeit.
Tell me what's the right.
Die Zeit. Yeah.
And so all over the world, we sort of reached out and said, look, we've got this journalism. We've got some time. We've got it incredibly fact-checked and legal, so that you can check our work and feel safe. And we want to see if you'd be willing in partnering with us. And so and in the US, our flagship partner was the New Yorker, but we also partnered with the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times. So by doing this in lots of languages in lots of places, and then sort of getting everyone to agree to simultaneity, that allowed a huge impact, huge reach, and then comes impact. And so it ran in 114 venues, 35 countries, 12 languages, and we still have pieces coming in some places. What has happened in the first 30 days after the first piece published? We had two pieces of European Parliament move forward. One was regulation, another one was a law that I had been told were not likely to pass, that then passed. That from the floor of the European Commission, there was testimony given about how this investigation had led them to adjust and support the law. We had a U.S. congressional hearing about the investigation and its findings. About half a dozen companies withdrew from the plants that we identified and severed ties and stopped working there. Huge follow-up coverage, and one of the biggest accomplishments, which may not sound like a big deal to you, but or to the public, but you as a journalist can understand, if you can get the industry press to get on board and start covering it, then that's when you really know. Because normally, as an outsider to a beat or a topic, you're viewed with skepticism. Who is this interloper who's coming into our area, writing about our topic? We know better than him. In this case, the industry press that specialize on seafood and this, they, for whatever reason, vetted this stuff and said, this is legitimate. We should go all in on it. And so we've had, dozens and dozens of follow-up stories about them, and just a bunch of other government, what are called WRO, with withhold and release orders. These are sort of legal documents that ask Customs and Border to stop specific imports. They're precursor to the UFLPA, the Uyghur Force Protection Act, which is a much blunter, bigger tool, but sort of more surgical hits on this company and these products no more should come in. And we've had two of those already dropped on big companies and requests for the Customs Department to stop them. And we have a bunch of big things coming in the next several weeks that will expand further in Europe and Canada tied to the investigation. So the impact has been pretty striking.
Wow, that's very impressive. And in terms of communication, I would also like to go back to the Uyghurs themselves. How do they communicate with the world about their situation themselves, considering their challenges they face, if they can at all? And what role does social media play in uncovering things that are happening there?
Yeah, Uyghurs in China don't communicate a lot because of the nature of China, and quite especially in the last couple of years with the anti-espionage law, it has really put a chill on that kind of communication with the outside world. There are some Uyghur organizations that have sources inside China, and they talk in safe ways. Social media is interesting. What's often called in journalism OSI, open source intelligence, is sort of a cutting edge, next generation method of getting eyes into places that are tough to get eyes in, whether it's Gaza or a factory in Shandong Province or North Korea, or just on fishing vessels. OSI is often a useful thing, which is to say, normally OSI is average cell phone footage, just regular people who are filming selfies, and everyone has phones now, and virtually everyone is making a habit of documenting their existence. And some of that stuff ends up online, usually innocuously, just like, hey, mom, look at me. I'm taking a train from Xinjiang to Shandong. Here I am. But with the right team, with the right skills, and this is where my team comes in, because they're the ones that have those skills and did all the work. You can kind of plumb, you can scrape all of that thousands of hours of Douyin is Chinese TikTok, and that's what we really mined to get eyes into all these places. Hey, how can we document how many workers moved from Xinjiang to Shandong? Well, let's figure out smart keywords that get us into the space, the informational space, where we can see lots of footage of people moving from A to B. And then let's look at them piece by piece and look at the comments and see which of them are Uyghurs that are moving into seafood processing. And so sort of, painstakingly doing that. And then the second big source for us was a funny source in that in China, some of these companies are massive and they have their own internal newsletters, and they're very open about talking about certain things because no one other than industry folks reads those things, right? And so in one company's case, a very huge company that exports 17% of all squid to the US and processes 30% of all Chinese squid, this company had this really great newsletter going back years and years and years, and it would talk about, oh, we had this huge meeting where the officials from Shandong Province came and offered us 150 Uyghur workers, and we said thank you, and it's all documented in their own documents, right? Talking about
Wow.
because vis-a-vis China, but in China, you got to understand this isn't illegal, right?
Mm.
In their own space, there's nothing to hide there. They're very proud. It's poverty alleviation program. We're helping that province by sending those people to good paying jobs. Outside the world, it's viewed very differently because those people are not given the choice to not take those thank you very much jobs. So those newsletters were super helpful and super useful. And we've got a video coming out probably this week that shows all the Douyin footage and the newsletters. And then the other sorts of open source, like satellite tracking of ships. And then we actually had some investigators that we hired to discreetly go to ports and follow trucks as they moved from the ship to the plant so that we could connect the dots. All that together adds up to a pretty strong body of evidence.
Wow, the power of social media. I would like to know, throughout your investigations, you have proven how difficult it is to tackle human rights abuses in the fishery sector and at sea. Looking forward, what are things you would like to do more of, or like where are areas that you still want to investigate, or what are next steps you would like to take to make more impact, as we were saying, or in general also uncover more things?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of, so just always take 3 steps back for 6 steps forward. When you think of bad stuff happening at sea, I think 10 years ago, the average well-read person would say, I know what that is. That's Somali piracy. That's plastic pollution. That's illegal whaling. That's oil spills. Like these are the big things that Hollywood and Der Spiegel and, like big news outlets have really like burnt into our mind. All true, all big issues, big problems. But one of the goals that we had was to diversify and expand that spectrum, that taxonomy of things out there that people think of when they think of what happens, good and bad, but mostly bad out there. So sea slavery, repo man of the ocean, arms trafficking, intentional dumping of oil, not spills, illegal whaling, territorial disputes, spoofing your location so it makes you look like you're over here, but you're over there so that you can get Iranian or North Korean oil and sell it to the Germans. Like all sorts of interesting, illegal, problematic things happening at sea, way beyond the typical set of topics that you know of, seabed mining, and on and on and on, right? Lots of different topics. So we want to really kind of be agile and not just become the ocean news outlet that focuses on sea slavery. No. So we want to pivot and move to different topics. The investigation prior to this one was a 1.5 year long investigation of abuse of migrants crossing the Mediterranean headed to Europe, and Libya's role as a proxy force and sort of illegalities on the water, mostly orchestrated by the EU and Italy, especially to do things that are illegal, but no one cares. But it's happening on the water and it's causing thousands of people to be sent back to horrific places. Okay, so that was an investigation unlike the one we're doing now. And the next one will probably be different too. The sea slavery thing and the abuse of humans that work on these vessels is going to be a constant. Like it's so hard to cover and so few news outlets do it. And it's such a huge problem that's going to be, we're always going to be working on that issue. But we're going to look at fish meal. So, roughly a fifth of all marine life pulled out of the water isn't for human consumption. It's for feed. So chickens,
Yeah.
pigs and aquaculture, and taking that stuff, you put them in a blender, make it a mush, dry it out, turn it into pellets, and feed it to other animals, and then those animals get fattened up quickly so that they get to market. Right? It's a crazy phenomena, using fish to feed other fish and
Yeah.
depleting the oceans. So, and it's got all sorts of other interesting concerns. It's a migration driver from Senegal to Canary Islands, Spain, and it's putting women out of work in Gambia, and it's like collapsing families because most of the women have one job, and it's the fishmongers on the beach who are selling and slicing and cleaning. And if all the fish is going into a factory that's for export, then they're not getting any of the product, and they're out of work, and now the family's collapsing. So they're very interesting ancillary issues that all tie to this one global issue of feed. So we're going to take a look at feed in general, and the politics of feed. Seabed mining is of interest, plastic pollution, but maybe a different angle, not like, hey, there's plastic in the water and it's ending up in your belly, but more like, hey, the oil and gas industry is kind of trying to find clever new ways to stay alive now that climate crisis is putting some heat on them. And plastic production is a nice, profitable side game that they've got that keeps them going and keeps the drilling happening. And sort of how plastic is a financial component of the fossil fuel addiction in general, that's interesting to me. And that feels like a story that we might tackle. So these sorts of things.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see them. And looking at all these like really solid issues, like solid structures and systems, and uncovering them. Are you still positive? Are you like hopeful? What have you seen any like big changes since you started this work? Have you seen things where you're like, yeah, this is what we want to see more of, and this is why it's worth it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's sort of like, um, you're a journalist, so I can speak in journalism terms. Like, you spend a year producing a series about injustice or war, the
Mm.
war, not a war, but war in general. Okay, and then someone comes to you and says, "Okay, you did this great series. So how do we solve war? How do we stop war? Or how do we solve injustice?" How do we deal with the outlaw ocean and illegality? I personally don't think you will. It's going to be always there. It's a question of how can you mitigate it, And so I don't really ever see us solving anything. I just see us maybe improving things a bit in some aspects of it. So bringing the ambitions down to that level, yes, my answer is we're having success. And what does success look like? It looks like, you know, a decade ago, or when I started on this kind of stuff in 2014, it was a non sequitur. It was like, as a concept, something that just people were like I said, they would say Somali piracy, right? Like, no, 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 there's way more happening than the Somali piracy. Get off Somali piracy. And now, you have a huge number, and that's with editors, right? And now you have a huge number of editors around the world who are pretty fluent on it. They've heard about this. The stories have been around enough. They're even having beat reporters that are assigned to cover this sort of stuff. The AP, the Guardian, doing really, really good work. The Pulitzer Center has a whole funded section on ocean reporting and some investigative reporting. So there are a lot of journalistic changes, which I think matters, not just because I'm a journalist and everything matters through journalism, but I think like the only way the public and lawmakers and NGOs and consumers are going to start doing their part is if there's a lot of spotlight over a sustained time on these issues. Then they're going to be seeing it over and over again, and they're going to start clicking in. I can't just be one-offs, like great one-offs like AP or the New York Times did in 2015. Great year of coverage. It's got to be like a decade of coverage. And then folks are like, okay, this is not going away. The seafood industry or whatever, the merchant marine industry are going to say, these folks are not going away. Like, all these venues are covering this ongoing. We've got to clean up so we can get out of the front page of these papers, or be there doing good things, not getting hit.
Yeah, very interesting. And where does your passion for the ocean come from out of all the fields that you could have picked to focus on?
I mean, so it's a funny, weird story. So I was a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist, and I was working on my dissertation, and I was burnt out 5 years in. I work on Cuba, and And so I took a little time off and went to Singapore and got on a research vessel. Never had spent time at sea or anything. We never left port. I was stuck there for 2 months,
Oh,
but
wow.
I got an exposure to the demographic that is seafarers. People who live and work on the sea, not people I grew up ever being exposed to, but became immediately fascinated, by their lifestyle, especially the hardcore ones that's what they do. And they've been doing it for many years, whether they're fishermen or yachtsmen or, merchant marine deckhands, whatever, like living at sea, their humor, the hierarchy, their superstitions, their code of conduct, their language, their experiences, their relationship with time, their families and their relationship with spouses when they're leaving. They're not like other people. It's a different workforce because it's a different lifestyle, and that fascinated me. So it became, I was interested anthropologically in the people first, and then their workplace second. Their workplace was out there. Once I got out into the workplace, and spent real time out there, then I became hooked on that too. I was like really fascinated by just everything that's different at sea. Your 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 sense of motion, again, your relationship with time, the structure of your day, weather, light, dangers, how conversational or not seafarers tend to be. Just everything about that weird space station called a ship, like captivated me. So I didn't grow up on boats. I grew up on land, and but I got hooked on the people first and the space second.
Very interesting. And what came out of it, or is coming out of it, is even more interesting. All these investigations.
Mm.
Um, I think I've asked all my questions. Is there anything else I haven't covered, or anything else you'd like to say about the China investigations specifically, or Outlaw Ocean?
No, I mean, I'll put a plug in for our organization. We're a tiny shop. We fund everything ourselves. China cost over $1 million to produce 4 years, went to sea for ungodly lengths of time, all over the place. And it's all funded by philanthropy or, average readers who are like, oh, I want to give $5 a month. And so I would just put a plug in. If you read it or watch the footage or whatever, and you think it's worthy, then support it, in whatever way you can. It's outlawocean.com is where you can find it.
And plenty of really interesting podcasts as well. I've listened to all of them, so I can really recommend them. Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And again, I mean, I would also say it's not China, especially. The book was me, but China and what we've done, I have an amazing team of researchers around me and investigators. And I do all the at-sea reporting, but a huge amount of what makes the journalism powerful is what comes from this amazing team that we have on staff. So, but thanks a lot for having me.